Hi, as I'm sure you know by now, I'm Ginger McClure, and my paper is about the role of Puritanism in establishing self government in the New England colonies. When the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded, its purpose was to try to implement Puritan values and beliefs in a way that they had been unable to do in England. Puritans in England up to this point had not gotten enough control to influence the Church of England and put their views into practice. John Winthrop, about a year before they left, wrote a pamphlet. He was encouraging settlers to come, but he talked about the purpose of the colonies, of the new colony. One was to spread Christianity, particularly Protestantism, in as Catholicism was spreading around the Americas. And most importantly, it was to save the church, to have a place where as the church fell apart, ended because of its problems and sin, a place where that could be a refuge for Christians in the face of, the eventual demise of the church. Another more famous speech of Winthrop's is when he talks about when they first got to Massachusetts, and he says that they are building a city on a hill that is to be viewed by everyone as an example of a truly godly society. And that's the purpose. That's why they came to New England. Here is my thesis. The distance between the Puritans in New England and religious and political leaders in England gave the Puritans freedom to establish the type of society they wanted. As they developed a church in which the congregation made important decisions, such as the selection of ministers, the close relationship between church and state encouraged ideas about self-government to spread to the political arena as well. So one of the important Puritan beliefs that set them apart from more traditional Anglicans was the idea that a church hierarchy was not needed. Individual Christians could govern their own relationships with God, and because of that, the congregation could govern the church. So there were many roles for Christians in the church. They did select the ministers, the elders provided church discipline, the deacons collected money for charity, and individuals also read the Bible and made their own theological decisions. That probably was not one of the intentions of the founders of the colonies, but there are many examples of people discussing theological issues, writing letters and tracts and sending them to other churches, just lay people doing that. So the role in the church was significant. The government that was set up in Massachusetts was a theocracy. John Cotton talked about why that was a good choice for Massachusetts. He discussed that the Bible says that monarchy and aristocracy are good forms of government, and that in a traditional situation, the biblical thing is for the church to be subordinate to the civil government. But because there was no pre-existing civil government, at least in the Western style, that the colonists came into, they were free to establish a brand new kind of government. And they chose a theocracy. The church and state are going to be very closely connected. We can see that in the Antinomian controversy. The people who challenged Puritan or the traditional beliefs of the New England church, they were tried in civil court, and were Anne Hutchison and her brother-in-law, John Wheelwright, were banished by the civil court and excommunicated by the church. So that shows that that close connection between them. Despite the similar underlying views, the church in New England is going to develop some theology that is different. One of those will be in how people join the church. And church membership is extremely important in Massachusetts because church membership and citizenship are tied together. If you are not accepted into the church, you have have no say in the government because you are not a citizen. So, unlike in England, where if someone declared themselves a Christian and said that Christ had saved them, they became a church member. In New England, there was an expectation of a public confession of sins and public demonstration that the conversion was real. They used biblical evidence to support this, the idea that when Paul had his conversion experience, he was not accepted into the church immediately. He had to convince the apostles that it was a true, or he didn't, but someone had to convince the apostles that it was a true conversion experience. John the Baptist didn't baptize people until after they confessed their sins. They believed this was necessary to make sure that everyone in their church shared their beliefs. And there were some disagreements and letters back and forth from Puritans in England who did not believe this was necessary, but those in Massachusetts did. And it's largely because they wanted to protect the elect from the persecution they had faced in England by requiring citizens to be members of the church and share the same views as the rest of the church and community. They were protecting themselves from possibly someday getting a leader that did not share their views and possibly was even hostile to Puritan beliefs as they had faced back in the old country. So I've kind of gone out of order here, so let me check my notes. As the church was set up, the governors of the church, the idea was to base it, and what they kind of saw as basing it on the Roman Republic. They saw the Roman Republic as the Senate was an aristocracy, but the people were protected from abuse by the Senate because they had their own tribunes that represented the people. And this is how they saw church leadership. The people chose their minister and could take the minister out of his position if they felt it was warranted. But once he was chosen, the minister and the elders would be the ones governing the church, not the people. The New England Puritans were very much opposed to democracy. Democracy was not seen as biblical. And John Cotton said something, this isn't a quote, but something like, if the people are the governors, who are they governing? So they're opposed to democracy, but they're not opposed to what they saw a government of liberty, a government where the people had authority over the people that were doing the actual day-to-day governing of the church. They also were expected to obey once they chose a church leader, unless that church leader did something that would require him to be replaced. They were expected to obey him and trust him. As they set up their civil government, they're going to model that after it as well. They, first of all, again, protecting themselves against some of the problems that they faced in England. In Massachusetts, they will have the Massachusetts Body of Liberty, which is a series of laws that limits the civil government's power over the church. This is a theocracy, and the church is the more important of those two combined branches. So the civil government could not keep church members from assembling. They had no control over the selection of ministers or church officers or the collection of tithes or what happened with the tithes. It is far from separation of church and state. As I said, it's a theocracy, but they are taking away any power of the government, civil government, over the church to protect church members from abuses. So moving in the direction of separation of church and state. The church was set up kind of with a triad. You have the, where is it? You have the minister, the elder, and the brethren, the congregation. And the civil government was set up in a similar way with the governor, the magistrates, and the general court, which was made up of deputies that represented the various cities in Massachusetts. In the same way that the people selected the ministers, but the ministers did the governing, the people they elected a governor and the magistrates, but they let the magistrates do their job, and then their deputies were there to protect them from abuses by the civil government. We will see more democracy as time goes on in New England, it's not really democracy, but a little bit more of democracy coming in. In Connecticut, they will have the Fundamental Orders. That is considered the first Western-style constitution that protects certain liberties of the people. In Massachusetts, the deputies are going to push to have equal votes with the magistrates, and in some certain circumstances, they will eventually achieve that. But all of this is like 1640s and beyond. When the Civil War broke out in England, the New England Puritans took credit for a lot of it. They believed that their example of having a godly society and seeing how successful they were under Puritan rule helped encourage Parliament and Puritans to rise up against Charles I. And they will do a ton to help out with the conflict. During the Civil War, they will set aside special days of prayer and Thanksgiving and fasting. Thanksgiving if something good had happened for Parliament, and prayer and fasting if there seemed to be more of a need for assistance from God. They wrote so many letters and pamphlets with advice on how to set up a godly government in England once Parliament wins the war. And all the important ministers, Cotton, Bradford, Mather, as well as a lot of people that most of us have not heard of. So like 30 or 40 different people wrote about how England should set up a new government. Once the Parliament won the war and Oliver Cromwell, the Commonwealth was established and Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector, they will continue to help. I did not say that one of the ways they helped is they actually, many people during the Civil War will go to England, will fight in the war, will become members of Parliament, and just be regular people who support these changes now that the Puritans are going to be in charge. That will continue under the Commonwealth to a point where it's a little bit dangerous. Like, very few people are moving from the old England to New England because the persecution's over, and many people are going back to England now that they have the opportunity to do that. The colonists saw Oliver Cromwell as the person who was going to lead Christianity into the millennium, the 1,000 years before Christ's return. And they are going to do all kinds of things to try to help that happen. More missionary work to Native Americans, missionary work in the Catholic parts of the Caribbean. That's the goal. But when Oliver Cromwell dies, everything kind of dies with him. The whole system was built around him. And the restoration of Charles II was a huge blow to the New England colonists, who saw the Civil War and the Commonwealth as a vindication and triumph for Puritanism and for their decisions. And it was very hard for them. It was dangerous too. They had supported Charles I's enemies, and Connecticut and Rhode Island actually got their charters during the Long Parliament, so they were not even officially colonies. And they will very quickly, in hopes of getting Charles's support and getting official royal charters, will acknowledge Charles is king. It's going to be harder for Massachusetts, the leader of the rebellion, but eventually they have to do that as well. The Puritanism will start to be second class again, and many of the people who had moved back will be coming to New England again, but this time, like, they still have hope for the future, but it's a different kind of hope. They are no longer the example. Clearly, Puritanism isn't going to be the way in England, but their self-governing things are going to continue even after the Restoration. And the ideas of Puritanism, the ideas that people can make important decisions about their lives, Puritans believed spiritually, but as that moves into the civil world, it's no surprise that some of the earliest and strongest rebellion against tyranny comes from New England in the 1750s and beyond, because they had a tradition. They came to the United States in their efforts to end tyranny. In this case, the tyranny of the Bishop Laud in the Church of England. But anyway, that's pretty much it. They are going to continue to have self-government, even though their hopes of being an example for the whole world are now gone. We did it. We made it through the class. I've enjoyed watching your videos, and I'm looking forward to seeing your papers. Have a great holiday season.